Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob. Let's draw Ryuko Matoi. Yuko is a character from the new anime Kill la Kill. And I must admit, I actually haven't seen all of the show. I've only seen 2 episodes, but what I've seen I've liked, and I've especially fallen in love with the character designs. They're really, really well done, so I figured, hey, let's do a let's draw of it. So to start with, I've of course begun with a basic skeleton. I demarcated where the top of my head should be, and I built the rest of the skeleton based off of that, making sure the proportions are still accurate. You know, making sure that the torso, the head are in proportion to each other, making sure that I've got sort of this nice sense of movement, this sort of balance to the overall pose without being completely flat or facing directly toward the viewer, things like that, because you never want a full flat-on view like that unless you're doing a technical drawing or a piece of concept art, something that's trying to communicate overall design. If you're making just pinup art, which this definitely is, as an aside, because it's a pinup, I made sure to increase the bust to some kind of caricature, because really pinup art is caricature. It can be realistic, but at the end of the day it's definitely exaggerated. That's sort of the calling card of pinup art. But anyway, I digress. The point is, when you're making an illustration, you typically don't want anything flat. Everything should be either moving toward the viewer or away. It should be slightly canted, which means tilted off of the vertical plane. Just anything except up and down, left and right, flat, facing the viewer. You always want to have a consistently changing sense of depth with all the elements in the drawing. And so that's what I've done here. With this pose, I've got her tilted 4/5 of the way away from the viewer. Just, you know, something that makes you feel like there's some sort of movement, some sort of motion to the image. As you can see, I've changed the position of her weapon several times. I changed the orientation of her arm slightly a few times, and even here I'm still working a bit with the arm furthest away from the viewer. I'm trying to find something that doesn't quite run off the edge of the page, but at the same time isn't forced. I almost had it there with her hand slightly raised above hip level. However, I noticed that it was still going to run off the edge of the page, and I could have made her pull her hand back to bring it back into frame, but then the pose would have been informed by the space available in the picture, and it should never be that way. The framing of the image should not dictate the pose that you take. So to avoid having a very awkward and sort of forced movement, I just put her hand on her hip. That sort of solves the problem because it now brings the silhouette of the character back into the center of the image. So you're bringing focus back into the part of the image that we really want. So having finally settled on a good pose, having gotten all my guidelines down, having gotten the overall sketch complete, I duplicated the layer, set it to multiply, filled the original layer with the background color, and began my color wash. Color wash went by really quickly, so now here I am. I'm skipping the shadows and highlight stage that I normally do, because in this case I sort of want to evoke the anime feel of the source material. So I don't want this illustration to have as much soft shadowing and as many sort of hallmarks of realism that I normally have. It should feel very anime. At the same time, though, I'm not one to paint in a purely anime-inspired. Why is that so hard to say? An anime-inspired way. So I'm still keeping true to the way that I normally draw. However, I'm ever so slightly exaggerating it. I'm ever so slightly making it more anime to sort of pay respect to the source material. So here I'm just filling out shadows and highlights. As you'll notice, again, the easiest way to handle hair is to start with your darkest values, your darkest colors first, and then layer on the lighter colors on top of that, the lighter values on top of that. There are other ways to do it, but it just seems for me that that's the fastest way, and it gets pretty good results, working from darkest to lightest. Now here I'm adjusting a bit of the proportions of the face. Because I sped through so quickly with the original guidelines, I didn't really take as much care as I should have establishing the overall figure, establishing the basic framing. This isn't a showstopper. I mean, it's very easy to change anything in a painting. You can always paint over what you've done, so you never really lose anything except time. But in this case, it's not really a complicated image. There's not too much, and I wasn't too far off the mark, so we've only lost maybe 30 seconds in time-lapse footage. You'll see later on that I'll actually adjust the face a bit with the warp tool. In Krita, this particular brush pack, it's called the Move tool. Unfortunately, Krita doesn't have as many warp functions readily available as Photoshop, so you'll have to do a bit of searching to find it, but I'm sure you can. I'll post the link in the description, just to simplify. Now here, at this point, all I'm really doing is rendering out the basic forms, making sure that my lighting is consistent and strong. I want to give a good sense of where the lighting is coming from to sort of help bring dimension into this image. If you keep your lighting too flat, too consistent, no matter what your pose is, no matter how many vanishing points you're taking advantage of, no matter how many receding elements, no matter what you've done to establish foreground, midground, and background, if you have bad lighting, all of that can be blown away and completely lost. So you have to take care. Your lighting should sort of play against your overall composition and vice versa. So in this case, I've made sure that I have a good, strong main light coming from the top left with a kicker light coming in from the right and a strong fill coming in from the left, lower left. These three elements combined help establish the overall form of the image because there are three lights that are almost exactly there are three lights that are almost perfectly in opposition. If you imagine a circle just above this character and you cut that into thirds, if you have a light in between each slice, you'll have the right idea of where to place your lights in your scene. Doing it in that way, imagining it in that way, allows you to place the lights such that you have a nice highlight, back into shadow, and then gradually back into light again. And that gradual transition really helps sell the form of pretty much any object that you have, anything that you put into your piece, in any kind of composition will really look best when you have that sort of more than 90-degree opposition between lights. Now at this point, with my lighting established on the face, with my foreground, midground, and background sort of established within the character's elements itself, like the bow tie on her chest, the arm going back into the blade in her hand. This sort of establishes a lot of depth. So now that I have everything laid out and I have a good sense of movement and a good sense of composition in the scene, I'm just rendering my forms based on the established lighting values.